Presenting to the Commission today is Mr. Jayendra Naidoo, and he has taken the stand.
Can the witness take an oath or an affirmation if there's a problem with the oath?
Thank you, Chair. The evidence of Mr. Naidoo, as well as, or rather the statement of Mr. Naidoo, as well as supporting documents, are contained in one file. So any reference that is going to be made today will be from that one file that has been submitted to the commissioners. May I proceed, Chair? Thank you. Mr. Naidoo, you are the Executive Chairman of J&J Group. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
You have attached a short curriculum vitae to the statement, and it is marked JN1. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that curriculum vitae appears in page 39 of the file.
That's correct.
You have made a statement for use at this commission hearing, and the last page is page 38 of the bundle. Do you see that?
I see that.
That statement is dated the 7th day of June 2014, and it has a signature on top of the name Jayendra Naidoo. Is that your signature?
That's my signature.
Do you confirm that the contents of the statement are the correct reflection of what you want to deal with before the commission today?
I confirm that.
Commissioners, before I proceed to delete the witness from his statement, I'd like to bring it to the attention of the commission that Mr. Naidoo, being the appointed chief negotiator in the SDPP exercise or procurement, had to report to the ministerial committee and also when given a go-ahead by the ministerial committee, he would report to cabinet. Now, in his presentation of evidence, he will rely on memory as well as minutes where possible. I just want to bring it to your attention that the following sets of minutes and presentations are not available, but to an extent possible, Mr. Naidoo will rely on his memory, and the ministerial committee minutes of the 6th day of April 1999 are not available, and also the presentation of that to that meeting is not available. The meeting of the 31st day of August 1999, we do have the minutes in the bundle. However, the presentation that was made by Mr. Naidoo on behalf of the IONT is not in the bundle, and the Commission has indicated that it has not been able to trace those minutes. The meeting of the 24th day of November 1999 is actually referred to as the last meeting at which the IONT made a presentation. Now, those minutes are not available, as well as the presentation that was made at the meeting of the 24th day of November. It's not available. The Commission has indicated that it is unable to trace those minutes. And may I just take one step back and also indicate that according to Mr. Naidoo, there was also a meeting that was held on the 14th day of September 1999, that is just on the eve of his presentation to the Cabinet. The minutes of that meeting or briefing that he gave to the Ministerial Committee are not available, and as well as any presentation that was made there. But I would just like to highlight that it may be possible that the presentation could be substantially the same as the presentation that was made to Cabinet the following day. But as to whether that is so or not, Commissioners, it is something that, if possible, may be clarified by Mr. Naidoo. The presentation of the 31st day of August 1999 is also referred to in the evidence that Mr. Naidoo presented before JIT on the 13th of June and 14th of June in 2001. But even at that hearing, he indicated that he was not in possession of that presentation, but that presentation should be in the custody of his principal, in this case, the institution that had given him mandate. Having given this background to the Commissioners, I will now proceed to lead the evidence through the statement. May I proceed, Chair? Thank you. Mr. Naidoo, you have been requested to come and present evidence before the Commission, and you have agreed to cooperate, notwithstanding the fact that you were not subpoenaed. Is it correct?
That's correct. I was informed that the subpoena would be served, but it has not been served, so I'm here voluntarily at your request.
Right. Now, in terms of paragraph 3 of your statement, you indicate that you have previously given evidence before the Joint Investigation Task Team, which will from time to time be referred to as the JIT, and you did present your evidence there, and you have, in this statement, incorporated relevant portions of your briefing to the JIT hearings. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, you also indicate that you will not just restrict yourself to the evidence that you presented to the JIT. However, you are willing to, from time to time, highlight wherever you are required for more information, provided that you are able to do so.
I will answer all questions to the best of my ability.
Now, turning to page 2 of your statement, you indicate in pages 2 and part of page 3 as to what is it that this statement is going to deal with. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in pages 3 to pages 4, you just give a synopsis or just in a point form the chronology of events. Is that correct?
That's correct. These are events dealing with the time from my appointment as chief negotiator until my the duration of my contract expired.
Right, thank you. Now I'd like you to turn to page 5 of your statement. And briefly, I'd like to invite you to give this commission the background relating to your appointment and as to who you reported to and how that would be done. That appears from page 5, paragraph, under background, it's the sub-paragraphs 1, 2, 3.
I was appointed as the chief negotiator on the defense packages, as we call it, by Deputy President Thabo Mbeki on 9th of December 1998. However, I commenced duties on the 20th of November 1998 already, after informal approach by the Minister of Trade and Industry, Alec Owen. My contract was undertaken via Arms Corps, and I had a budget to employ a personal assistant and to contract a small number of professional support staff. I reported directly to the Deputy President, who subsequently became President during the course of that year, 1999. And the Ministers' Committee, which was constituted by Cabinet for the purpose of this, consisted of the Minister of Defense, Minister of Finance, Minister of Trade and Industry, and with the involvement of the Minister of Public Enterprises. The Ministry of Public Enterprises was associated with this, but was present in the Ministers' Committee, but their department had a lower level of involvement with the activity of the International Offers Negotiating Team, as the body was called. The body, International Offers Negotiating Team, was comprised of members of those three departments. On the side of Defense, it was represented by Arms Corps, supported by the Department of Defense, and in the side of Finance by the Department of Finance, and side of Trade and Industry, the Department of Trade and Industry had a representative in this committee. Would you like me to cover also the contents of paragraph 3?
Just before you proceed to the next paragraph, you mentioned in paragraph 2 of your statement that you met with the Deputy President prior to each meeting of Ministers' Committee except the meeting of April 1999. Now, are you able to tell the Commission as to why, in respect of this meeting, you did not meet with the Deputy President prior to that meeting?
I I can't recall a specific reason. I would think that he was not present in the, and not available. If memory serves me right, he also didn't attend that meeting, but I may be wrong.
Thank you. In paragraph 3 of your statement, you mentioned that you also met separately with each of the ministers who were members prior to each ministers' committee meeting to brief them on progress and to understand their perspective on the issues. Now, can you indicate to this commission as to whether you would, in your briefing with the line ministers, also present them with a pack that would have been presented at the ministerial committee meeting, or would it just be a sort of informal briefing with each line minister?
There were document packs prepared in advance of each ministers' committee meeting, which would have been circulated to the minister prior to the meeting so that he would be able to read it and come fully prepared to the meeting. There were very few documents that were presented at the meeting cold. So I wouldn't have a additional document to present to the minister. The purpose of these meetings was simply to help them become familiar with the contents, with the work that had been undertaken, and to get a view from them on what were the key issues, so that in the ministers' committee meeting itself, one would be able to help facilitate a consensus by dealing with the issues, whatever the issues were that were requiring discussion to be smoothed out beforehand.
Thank you. Still on paragraph 3, but in page 6. In the statement, you make mention that where necessary, you would refer the Commission in particular to the minutes of the Ministers' Committee of the 20th January, 6th April, 26th May, 31st August, and 24 November. Now, it is correct, sir, that at the time when you signed the statement, you signed it in anticipation of receipt of also minutes of the 6th day of April 1999, as well as the minutes of the 24th day of November 1999, which are unfortunately not available today. Is it correct?
That's correct.
Commissioners, I would request that then that statement should read the rest of the minutes except the 6th of April 99 and the 24th day of November 99. Now, the resultant effect would be that even the number of annexures would change, but that is something that can be taken care of later. What I'd just like to sensitize you to is that you will not find all the annexures 2 to 6 in the bundle, because the bundle that we have given you, we had left those blank and they will continue to be as such. May I proceed? Thank you. In paragraph 4 of your statement, you also mentioned that you met with heads of departments or advisors to ministers from time to time. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, in paragraph 6, you also mentioned that you had numerous interactions even with other interest groups, and you mentioned those interest groups, or rather, you just say interest groups of certain institutions. Do you confirm that that was the case then? In page 7 now of the statement, you are talking about your open communication with the Government Communications and Information System. Is that where you would then give information to the general public from time to time, or what is the position? What was the purpose of that communication?
It was both to inform the senior members of the media, so they would get a good insight into what was a issue of some depth and complexity. So in their work and their reporting, they'd be better informed. And then it was also to directly participate in media briefings where the public at large was directly informed through those media briefings.
And moving on then, in paragraphs 1 and 2, you give information about your appointment and the public announcement of your appointment, as well as to when your appointment formally came to an end. However, you do mention that you were supposed to render further services from the 3rd of December up until the financing contracts had been concluded and signed by the Minister of Finance. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, effectively, you parted ways with your work as the chief negotiator finally in or around January or beginning February. Is it fair to say so?
When the finance contracts were signed at the end of January, my association with this project was completely concluded.
Now, take us through paragraph 3, where you deal with your core function as the chief negotiator.
My core function was to chair the negotiations with the preferred bidders and to direct and lead the South African negotiating team to the desired outcomes in respect of an agreed affordable package. This mandate required consensus internally within the South African government and between the government and the preferred bidders, as well as between the government and the finance institutions. The government in this case being represented by Deputy President and later President Mbeki and the subcommittee of ministers and their departments.
Thank you. And you also mentioned in the succeeding paragraph that the appointment was initially envisaged to be for 6 months, but we now know that you served as such for about a year or so. Now, shall you then proceed to go to the next topic, and that is the establishment and terms of reference of the negotiating team and affordability team. Now, when you present evidence in this line, I just want to bring it to your attention that Mr. Andrew Donaldson has already testified before this commission, and he has spoken about the establishment of the affordability team. He has also spoken about the constitution of the affordability team. So I'll invite you to actually focus more on the key issues addressed in the terms of reference that you were given as the IONT.
The first meeting that I was party to was one convened on the 20th of November 1998 by the Minister of Trade and Industry, and that involved representatives from the Department of Defense, Department of Trade and Industry, Finance, and myself to discuss the question of establishment of a negotiating team. That led to my contract with the Arms Corps and involvement as the chief negotiator, and a terms of reference document was drawn up. This was finally approved in the first formal meeting of the Ministers' Committee, which was on the 20th of January 1990. And the 1999. Thank you. 20th January 1999. The negotiating team was required to negotiate an achievable funding arrangement and an affordable package with the preferred suppliers, which will result in final contracting. That's the phrase that was used. And further, it was to negotiate and conclude an affordable set of contracts which satisfactorily combines the technical, industrial participation and financial imperatives of the South African government. That terms of reference is part of the document pack here. The negotiating team consisted of the following representatives, if I can go to that directly. I have that actually on paragraph 5 on page 10. Perhaps I should wait for you to get there.
Right then, maybe let me just take you a step back about the terms of reference. From the minutes, as well as the minutes of the 20th day of January 1999, as well as the annexures thereto, there are two documents that are described as terms of reference. I want to believe at that stage they were still draft terms of reference. And the two documents were then considered, were tabled before the committee, and the ministerial committee then, having considered the two documents, then they indicated that in principle they would endorse the document described as Annexure B, because there were two. There was one marked Annexure A, the other one marked Annexure B, as the terms of reference that you would use moving forward, subject to some amendments that had been suggested at this meeting. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, looking at the minutes of the meeting held on 20th January, I can confirm that two annexures were presented, and after discussion at the meeting, it was decided that the document contained in Annexure B would be used as the base document from which further changes would be considered.
Are you able to inform this commission as to whether there is any final document that was adopted as the terms of reference for the IONT?
I believe that the meeting of the 20th of January adopted these terms of reference, that's in Annexure B, with certain changes which were operationally effective. And I'm trying to find the documents now. I see it's in 43U.
May I just help you say, if you look at page 41 of the bundle, Commissioner, page 41 is the second page of the ministerial committee meeting minutes. Now, when we talk about Yeah, when you talk about subject to changes that should be made, are you referring to these issues, issue 1, 2, 3, and 4, that were raised by the specified ministers with regard to terms of reference? And I'm asking you this because from these minutes it's indicated that Annexure B would be adopted subject to the factoring in of these issues raised by the ministers. Is that what you are looking for?
I believe that's correct.
Right. Thank you then. So that then became the basis upon which you were to operate. Now, the specific terms of reference of your team have actually already been quoted into the record by Mr. Alec Ewin at the time when he presented his evidence. Shall you then proceed to paragraph 4, where you are now talking about the specifics that had to be done or undertaken by the negotiating team? In particular, I would like to draw your attention to the last line in that paragraph, paragraph 4, which reads, the whole negotiation of the NIP terms was conducted by the full negotiating team rather than separately by the DTI, while initially the chief negotiator and the Department of Finance engaged in the finance negotiations. Subsequently, these were conducted by the Department of Finance, assisted by the Department of Defense. Can you just shed light on this very last part of the sentence where you say, at a certain point, then the negotiations relating to finance were then done by the Department of Finance, assisted by the Department of Defense? Does that mean that at that time the negotiating team had taken a step back, or what is the position? Please explain.
The initial negotiations with the preferred bidders and the export credit agencies and the international banks were conducted by the team, and primarily the representative of the Department of Finance, Mr. Roland White, and myself leading that. But the Department of Finance had sufficient capacity. So as the negotiations moved forward, they were, in the context of the negotiating team, they managed that negotiation without any further input from myself or the members of the negotiating team, except at the points when they reported back and they got feedback. So we did have to coordinate what was being undertaken in each of the different negotiation areas, but they conducted that negotiation and led that negotiation, and the Department of Defense did play a supportive role to them in that.
Also mentioned that the technical area was actually left to AMSCO and the Department of Defense, provided that they did not exceed the cost approved by the Cabinet in November 1998. The evidence that has been presented before the Commission also is to the same effect, that the Department of Defense would actually be charged with dealing with issues, the technical areas. and you confirm that. Now, I want you to turn to page 10 of the statement, unless there is anything else that you want to highlight on paragraph 4 in page 9. Is there anything else that you'd like to highlight?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks then. In page 10, paragraph 5 in particular, you are talking about the constitution of the negotiating team. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then in paragraph 6, you allude to the fact that the negotiating team was also supplemented by government staff of affected or relevant departments. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, will you just highlight anything important that you'd like to talk about in this paragraph? Because I see you're talking about the financial modeling and analysis, as well as the proposed NIP projects.
The financial modeling, which was later on taken over under the affordability team, which was a subset of the negotiating team, was undertaken primarily by the contract staff hired by the Department of Finance, a consultant hired by myself in my capacity as chief negotiator, and in conjunction with the Bureau for Economic Research at the University of Stellenbosch, who had a macroeconomic model that was then used to test the assumptions related to this project. The values of the NIP projects and what could be assumed in terms of their impact with regard to investments, revenue, be it exports or domestic sales, and any other relevant economic factor, that had to be assessed by people who were more closer to the coal face within the DTI and who had done the work on these projects. So they made input on all of that. We didn't independently assess that project, except for certain projects which will be referred to later, where because of the major impact they had because of their size, we had some independent consultants, international consultants, evaluate, particularly in the steel industry area.
Right, thank you. That now leads us to paragraph 7, that deals with the experts that you sought in order to increase or enhance the capacity of the negotiating team. Will you please take the Commission through that?
At the first meeting of the Ministers' Committee on the 20th of January 1999, it was agreed that due to the size and importance of this project, that world-class advisors should be obtained. Firstly, in legal, and as a result of that, a process of engaging a short list of legal advisors was undertaken, and the firm White & Case was selected. This was undertaken primarily by the departments involved, being Department of Defense, supported by Department of Finance. And so they chose the White & Case. It was undertaken under the auspices of the multi-departmental negotiating team, but executed that way. And then in addition, on the financial side, there was a need for a financial service support team to assist the team in the finance negotiation, in particular with the export credit agencies. And the Department of Finance undertook a process via a shortlist and selected Warburg Dillon and Reed, which was a London-based investment bank.
Right, thank you. And in the following paragraph, you making reference to what happened after the meeting of the 6th day, Ministerial Committee meeting of the 6th day of April 1999. Now, before dealing with what happened after that meeting, are you able to inform the Commission about any presentation that you made to this meeting, any resolutions that were made by this meeting except for the formation of the affordability team, as well as any mandates that were given to you at this meeting of the 6th day of April 1999?
To revert to page 3 of the statement, which deals with the chronology of events, and using that as a tool to refresh the memory, I can try and reconstruct what was discussed at the 6th of April 1999 meeting. And you will see on page 3, under chronology of events, item 4 says commencement of the work program, 20th of January. And that would be the work program that emanated from the First Minister's Committee. So during the period from 20th of January to 6th of April, the negotiating team traveled to meet the various bidders in Europe, in the UK, in Germany, in Sweden, in Italy, I believe. I'm not 100% sure. I kind of have no memory of whether we went to Italy or not. And entered into discussions with them about their programs, about the industrial participation projects they were offering, looked at their sites, met with the export credit agencies in these countries, met with the banks. So that in a short space of time, the team got a first-hand view of all of the key players and commenced the preliminary negotiations on the defense industrial participation and the technical negotiations, both those areas being dealt with by Arms Corps and Department of Defense. And they had already established document templates for this and established capability dealing with it. On the finance side, we were looking at creating a different agreement. So we had to do preparatory work on the kind of agreement and the kind of document template that would be applicable to this purpose. And so after the appointment of these advisors, which also took place in this period, we were reviewing the possible legal contractual documentation that would follow. And we were also assessing the NIP projects and reviewing the NIP system. So in the meeting on the 6th of April, I believe that we would have presented an outline of how the contractual documentation would flow. And you'll see somewhere in the pack there is a reference to the to that, so we can deal with that when we get there. We would have presented an overview of the documentation and some initial overview of the key issues around what is affordability. And the meeting of the 6th of April did resolve on the establishment of the Affordability Committee as a subset. So I would say that the two big decisions of that 6th of April meeting would be the contractual format for undertaking these negotiations and the establishment of the affordability team and the work of the affordability team to develop a more in-depth response to understanding the financial implications of this for the Republic.
Okay, thank you. Will you then proceed to take us through paragraph 9 and 10 of your statement? Those still deal with the affordability team as to how it was expected to operate, as well as to how it was constituted. Please proceed, sir.
The financial implications of this being so large, the affordability team was mandated to operate under the strictest confidentiality, and with a selected number of people that the Ministers' Committee felt confident could operate under this confidentiality and discharge the work required of the affordability team. And the brief of the affordability team was to evaluate the overall economic, fiscal and financial impact of the procurement on the Republic of South Africa. Part of the work of the affordability team was also to focus on the timing and the need for the different defense equipment types, the economic benefit to be delivered by the industrial participation offered, and the attendant fiscal and financial risks. The affordability team was tasked to prepare alternative scenarios for consideration by the Ministers' Committee so as to enable the committee to make a final decision about the scale and nature of the procurement. The team had 4 members, myself, I chaired it, Roland White from the Department of Finance, Paul Jordan of the Department of Trade and Industry, and Chibi Sheikh of the Department of Defense. In staff, it was supported by Dr. Stephen Gelb, an economist who was contracted in by myself, and Mr. Clive van Huren, who was contracted in by the Department of Finance. At a later stage, IDC had some input, and then the Department of Bureau of Economic Research at the University of Stellenbosch was contracted to assist the affordability team with the economic modeling exercise. Furthermore, there were a consortium of 3 U.S. consulting firms that specialized in steel market analysis that were contracted for specific tasks, as well as a Mr. K. Yamaguchi, who was an analyst attached to Warburg Dillon Reed in London, that were already appointed as the financial advisors to the South African government. And he reported on the viability of the steel projects as well. If you would like me to go on, there was obviously an overlap between the negotiating team and the affordability team. The negotiating team had now a larger number of people that involved Arms Corps and Department of Defense officials, as well as the Department of Trade and Industry officials who were dealing with the DIP, NIP, and technical aspects. And the affordability team had the senior members of the negotiating team and these resource people looking more distinctly at the affordability aspect. So there was a nexus between the two, which was managed by the individuals who are part of both teams.
Right, thank you. Now, having taken us through how the affordability team was constituted and how it was supposed to work, will you then take the Commission through the next topic, which is the assessment of the negotiation position? Right at the inception, as the negotiating team, you had to do an analysis and assess the negotiation position. Please go ahead.
As a logistical exercise, it was quite a vast undertaking. There were 6 preferred bidders, so everything had to be done 6 times. Each contract would have 3 separate sub-agreements, which was a contract for the supply of the equipment, for the defense industrial participation, and for the non-defense industrial participation. And then associated with each contract, there was a separate finance contract which had to be negotiated, which involved a international bank.
I think further on you are just elaborating on the magnitude of the work that had to be done and how you went about doing internal discussions as well as negotiations, interdepartmental discussions, and even discussions with the outsiders or the identified suppliers. Now, and even the number of contracts that you would have to conclude. Now, in paragraph 5, page 13 of the bundle, you mentioned that the South African team had to seek to reduce the cost of the package and ensure that the DIP and NIP commitments were both substantial and solid. Will you just take us through that and highlight where necessary about how you were going to go about dealing with these NIPs, DIPs, as well as the cost cutting?
Because the exercise was to reach an affordable outcome, we had to balance each of these aspects. And the first way of making it more affordable was to review the size of the package of equipment to be purchased, the cost of it, and ways to downsize that. The package had already been put out on tender as a result of the defense review that had been undertaken, which had been approved by Parliament. So our work was not really a price negotiation on that equipment, but a review on the equipment, the timing of the equipment, whether it could be pushed out in any way, whether certain packages would be prioritized and others could be deprioritized. So in that way, to reduce that, the Department of Defense and Arms Corps, when faced at a later stage with input about the cost parameters, also went in and did some re-speccing of the packages with a view to reducing the overall cost. So that was one set of strategies. With regard to industrial participation, the work to be done was to evaluate whether the industrial participation was in fact realistic, and ways in which we could make the industrial participation larger in size than what had been offered, to increase it, and therefore it increased the reciprocal benefit to South Africa, and how to make it more tangible where we felt it was at risk in some or other kind of a way. And there was a third element which is not referred in this paragraph, but is probably referred to in other paragraph, is to manage the financial cost in terms of the funding costs, the currency risks associated with that funding, the payment terms, the due dates in which payments were to be effected, and the cash flow implications for South Africa, for the government in that.
Now, in pursuance of your mandate, you then went on to consider the changes that should be proposed to improve the national industrial participation system. Will you please take the Commission through that? That is the next topic that you are now dealing with. From paragraph 5, page 14, Commissioners.
There were two systems of industrial participation. One which was defense related, what's called the DIP system, which had been in operation previously for some time and had a mature directorate dealing with it and had a very exact view of the projects to be undertaken, and the linkage between the equipment being purchased and the DIP program was frequently present. So from an industrial policy point of view, it was easy to understand the linkages with our defense industry and the defense equipment being purchased and the DIP projects. The non-defense or national industrial participation system was one that had been established the previous year and had not been in operation for a long time, and was based on a system which required 9 different variables to be reviewed.
Thank you. Evidence has already been presented by the people from Department of Trade and Industry about the 9 variables that you are talking about, and the evidence that they have presented is that ultimately, through negotiations, that was then trimmed down to three requirements. Now, will you proceed to then dealing with the following paragraph, unless there's something important that you'd like to highlight in paragraph 2, page 15 of your statement?
Which paragraph would you like me to deal with now?
We're dealing with paragraph 2 on page 15 when I brought it to your attention that you need not deal with the detail relating to the 9 listed requirements with regard to NIP in the DTI. And the next paragraph would be paragraph 3 on the same page.
Yes. Paragraph 3 is also dealing with the NIP credits. Would you like me to deal with that?
In paragraph 3, maybe what I would like you to talk to the Commission about is this reference to the Cabinet statement of the 18th day of November 1998, where the indication was that the industrial participation performance was in excess of 100 billion. And even though the actual rand value amount committed did not exceed 30 billion for the DIP and NIP combined. Can you just clear that so that we understand as laypersons? The commissioners might not be laypersons, but for the benefit of the audience, please take us through that. Thank you.
my understanding is that in the selection of the preferred bidders, which was undertaken by the government prior to the announcement of certain suppliers as preferred bidders and prior to the establishment of the negotiating team and my involvement in it, that the bidders had presented, together with their supply terms, proposals with regard to industrial participation. And the aggregate value of the projects proposed by the successful preferred bidders was nominally roughly 100 billion rands. However, the tender required that the bidders would commit contractually to 50% of the contract price. So if on aggregate the nominal value of the contracts was 30 billion, even though they had 100 billion of indicative projects for industrial participation on the table, the binding contractual obligation that they would undertake would, in terms of that tender, be half, 15 billion. I think that's what the understanding I have, so that the actual rand value amount committed wouldn't exceed, it says here 30 billion, but I think if we had not changed the system with the consent of the bidders in pursuit of affordability, they would have only been required to commit to a smaller number than what was eventually committed at the end of 1999.
Thank you. And towards the end of that paragraph on the same page, you state that the negotiating team concluded that the administrative requirements of such a system in the context of a program as large as the defense procurement would place a high level of stress on the Department of Trade and Industry, and was also likely to limitations in respect of transparency and public oversight. Now, taking into consideration that you recognize that it may put a lot of stress on the department, did you come up with any suggestions on how the department could avoid the stress? I'm talking about the Department of Trade and Industry in particular. Or is that, would you like to deal with it later in your evidence?
I'm happy to deal with that now. The Department of Trade and Industry and our assessment of the NIP system was that it had a higher level of risk due to the design of it, which we proposed certain changes to, and due to the institutional capacity available to the Department of Trade and Industry to implement it. So on these two fronts, if you will see on page 16, paragraph 4, there were certain proposals with regard to the design of the system that was proposed, which I suppose we'll come to next. But from an institutional point of view, what was proposed is that a specialized NIP implementation agency should be set up. And we referred it to as a NIP implementing mechanism, and in subsequent Ministers' Committee meetings and presentation to Cabinet, that would all have been presented there. And the contracts referred to the implementation agency as a NIP implementing mechanism, which would allow the DTI to be supplemented by appropriate resources that could be gathered from outside of the department.
Right, thank you. Now, it is in this paragraph that you, paragraph 4 on page 16, that you mentioned that the revised system was agreed based only on investments, exports, and sales on a basis of R1 for one credit, and all the multipliers as envisaged in the existing NIP system were eliminated. Now, you mentioned that the multipliers were eliminated. Was there, in terms of the negotiations that you engaged in and ultimately the decisions or the agreements that were reached, was there a scope for the residual discretion to either add on to the three elements, or not the three elements in particular? Was there a discretionary residual power to also include the multipliers in the NIPs and DIPs? And I'm actually referring to the outcome of the negotiations that you had entered into and the agreements that were signed with the suppliers in the relevant departments.
The system, the original NIP system had, I believe, 9 different variables, where an investment which also had a technology dimension would receive certain credits for the amount, the rand value of the investments, and then also would receive credits for the rand value applicable to the technology, and would also receive credits for the rand value applicable to other multipliers, such as whether it was enhancing small and medium enterprises. As a result, when you added up all of these credits that originate from the original rand value investment, the number of credits would be a multiple of the amount of money invested. This would then, while it had a qualitative dimension that was of course relevant, in the context of making an affordable contract, the economic effect of the rand was not multiplied in the economy. The economic effect was based on the actual effect it had on our balance of payments, actual effect it had on generation of economic impact in the South African economy. So the negotiating team then proposed, after consulting with the defense companies, who were initially extremely reluctant to take such an idea on board, but due to the strength of the negotiations, the pressure on them as a result of affordability, having the risk that a package may be eliminated, or all of the packages could be eliminated if the South African government felt it was not affordable. So as a result of that negotiation process, they consented to an amendment to the system. This amendment was discussed with the Ministers' Committee, who approved it. It was factored into the affordability model, which was calculated, and which led to certain recommendations about the size of the system, but which took into account the revisions made by the negotiation process with the consent of the defense companies, such that we arrived at a contract, which I, of course, don't have a copy of. It has not been released to me, but certainly from my recollection and from the documents here in the pack that have been declassified, I can say that we arrived at a contract where the NIP system used was the amended system. And as a result, the objective of the team and the Ministers' Committee was to have roughly 1 rand of investment equal to 1 rand of expenditure on the procurement. In addition to the 1 rand of investment, for 1 rand of procurement, there was exports and sales counted in on a rand for rand basis. So only 3 factors were used: investments, exports, and sales, because they were all concrete numbers, and each number could be factored into an economic model. The NIP projects were not at the final stage. There was work being done on many of these projects, the steel mills and others, that was determining whether these projects were feasible, and feasible from a commercial point of view. So there was a path still to be undertaken on several of the projects, which would not be completed before the contracts were signed in the end of 1999. So it was obvious that the NIP implementing mechanism would have the flexibility to work with the suppliers to substitute certain projects if they failed the test of feasibility with other projects. However, my understanding is that the contract would still be on the basis of counting investments, exports, and sales as the three items to be evaluated for the NIP implementing mechanism. Having said that, it is, of course, within the power of the South African government and the cabinet to review from time to time, and I have no information as to how they took the process further after the contract was signed.
Now that you have touched on the contracts, just relying on memory, are you able to tell this commission as to what provision was made for the amendment of the agreements, in particular, because you are addressing the NIP agreement? Are you able to tell the commission as to how the amendment would have to be effected? Whether that could just be done unilaterally, whether there would have to be an agreement, whether there has to be in writing, or whether it can be done orally. What is the position, if you are able to assist the commission with that?
I have not been able to review the contracts, and it is 14 years ago since they were signed. So I'm not really able to give you a definitive answer. However, I have no recollection of any special procedure to amend that would be different to both parties having the right to make an amendment by mutual agreement, which would have to be recorded in writing, which is the standard amendment provision for contracts. I don't think in any contract, certainly not one of this nature, that any one party could amend it unilaterally. On the South African government side, I think the procedures for amending contracts would be consistent with whatever the government has been doing from before.
Right. Thank you, sir. Now, you have mentioned it in passing that this amendment to the NIP within the DTI, the NIP that would be based on 3 elements instead of the 9 elements, which were actually the policy of the department. My question here would be maybe to ask as to whether this amendment that you are talking about, reducing the elements from 9 to 3, is it something that was considered and approved by cabinet or not? And let me just explain why I'm asking this question. It is because there seems to be a concern as to whether, because the 9 elements NIP requirements is something that was policy of the department and it must have been endorsed by cabinet, as to what now the status of this amendment would be. I'm not asking you to give an opinion on the status. All I am interested in is whether this proposal did serve before Cabinet and what the outcome was.
I made a presentation to Cabinet on the 15th of September, I believe it was. And I have been given a copy of that presentation in preparation for this meeting, and it's in this pack. And the presentation clearly indicates that the change to the NIP system was disclosed explicitly to the Cabinet and reported to them. And all the decisions and calculations that were presented in the report to Cabinet and in the presentation I made were derived from using the amended version of the NIP system. So I believe that in the decisions taken by the Cabinet on 15 September and then the contracts approved on the 1st of December, the new system was endorsed. Prior to making that submission and the submission to the Ministers' Committee on this matter of the change to the NIP system was discussed with the DTI, and it was with their consent only that one could engage the suppliers about it. So I believe the Cabinet did support this.
Okay, thank you. Will you then proceed to deal with the...
Mr. Jayendra, if you don't mind, can you just repeat your last few statements? We couldn't quite hear you properly.
I was answering the question about the Cabinet and the changes that were proposed to improve the NIP system. And what I was saying is that in the presentation made to the Cabinet on the 15th of September, and if I have some time I can actually, perhaps I should try and find that. It's yes, and it's Annexure JN7, the Cabinet briefing on the Strategic Defence Package. Yes, and on page 63, or what's marked as page 63 in my file, and page 64, you will see the presentation deals with analysis of what is titled Non-Defense Industrial Participation, and the presentation says the NIP value was the highest single component of the package. There was a fair amount of external skepticism. It then deals with the analysis of international experience of offset, which shows that offset tend to succeed where there are large established world-class companies involved. The recipient country has clear industrial strategy. The recipient country has relatively developed industrial base. The recipient country has good governance, has institutional capacity. Institutional capacity exists to manage the offset. And then on page 64, it continues. The original NIP credit system counted both real and strategic benefits, and then it reports a revised system developed, credits only for investments, exports, and sales. So I'll just stop there because it goes on to the next few pages about NIP, but I think it deals with the question of whether the Cabinet was able to take into account the changes.
Right, thank you, sir. Unless there's anything else that the commissioners would like to ask on that presentation, we will go back to the statement.
I understand what you're saying, Mr. Jayendra. This is a presentation that you made to Cabinet. And in this presentation, you included your new proposed manner of counting the credits that the offerers should get, the new manner, the three elements that we have referred to. There was a policy of DTI, which policy was approved by the minister. Are you saying that the mere fact that you have included this in this presentation that you made to Cabinet, this means that the policy created by the Department of DTI has been amended? This is what you are trying to say to us.
No, sir. The presentation was one that was approved by the Ministers' Committee, which met on the 31st of August and then met again on the eve of the Cabinet meeting. So it was not a presentation of myself or the negotiating team, but really of the Ministers' Subcommittee.
Right, thank you. We may go back to your statement, page 16. We were at page 16 when, right. Now, will you then proceed to take the Commission through to the next topic, which is the legal framework, in page 16 of the statement?
The legal framework involved two agreements with regard to each defense equipment package: an umbrella agreement with the supplier, which was signed by the Minister of Trade and Industry, Minister of Defense, and which was an agreement between Arms Corps and the defense supplier, and which had three subsidiary agreements. Unfortunately, there's a block which is blank, but it should read supply terms. I've seen that in some other documents I've been looking at, so I can say that with confidence. The blank block on the left-hand side is supply terms, which probably should say Schedule A, I think, DIP agreement and NIP agreement, three agreements. And then there would be, in conjunction with each agreement between Arms Corps and a supplier, a loan agreement between the government represented by the Minister of Finance and the bank. So that was the architecture of the contract.
Are there any provisions of the umbrella agreement, and I'm talking about general provisions without referring to a particular supplier? Are there any provisions of the umbrella agreement that stand out in your mind and that you think it's necessary for you to highlight to this Commission?
No, there are none that I can think of highlighting.
Right, thank you. Then proceed to page 17 of your statement, the finance contracts. Will you take the Commission through that heading?
offer for supply included an offer for finance from each of the selected preferred bidders, which were supported by the export credit agencies of the countries from which the suppliers came from. And there were certain terms of the support from the export credit agencies, which is standard with how these agencies operate worldwide, but which the finance component of the negotiating team, supported by the Ministers' Committee, was seeking to improve, so that one was able to finance the entire contract based on export credits, including the down payment, and to reduce the costs, the margins, and the interest rates associated with this borrowing. I think that's the main story, as it is captured up to paragraph 8 on page 18.
Shall you then proceed to paragraph 9 about the maximum leverage that was achieved by the contracts, as well as paragraph 10?
As I indicated earlier in my evidence, the contract negotiations were undertaken primarily by the Department of Finance after the initial period. However, we coordinated the negotiations around the supply terms and industrial participation very closely with the finance negotiations, so that we could extract the maximum pressure and leverage. So in certain cases, meetings were cancelled with the negotiations on supply terms until we got a more favorable offer from the export credit agencies, and vice versa. As a result of which, we developed a best case scenario of what we could achieve, and the finance ministry reports, I think, that we achieved a substantial improvement in the finance terms, particularly to get funding via the support of the export credit agencies, and so not needing any forex-denominated commercial loans.
Right, thank you. You mentioned earlier on that one of the strategies that you had to implement or to consider was the review of the defense equipment. Now, it would appear that your presentation relating to this review or consideration served at the meeting of the 26th Ministerial Committee meeting of the 26th day of May 1999. Now, will you then take the Commission through that review? Because in your statement you also mentioned as to why the equipment was prioritized in the manner in which it appears on this page, as well as the recommendations that were made by the negotiating team. You may proceed, sir.
After the April meeting of the Ministers' Committee, in which the affordability team was established, part of the work of the Affordability Committee was now to conduct a review of the requirements of these different defense equipment. And I conducted that on behalf of the negotiating team and interviewed several parties. I met with the Chief of the Air Force, the Chief of the Navy, the Chief of the Defense Force, and the Minister of Defense individually with each of them to talk about the need for the defense equipment under consideration, the timing of these needs, alternative approaches to meeting these needs, and what flexibility in the context of affordability would be possible. And I reported back to the negotiating team and took the views of the members of the negotiating team into consideration, in particular the Chief of Procurement of the Department of Defense and the Chief of Arms Corps, who had a high degree of familiarity with the requirement. And came to the conclusion after these interviews that the light utility helicopters were urgently needed to replace the existing stock. The lead-in fighter trainers were urgently needed by the Air Force. The advanced light fighter aircraft, the Alpha, were not an immediate requirement, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The submarines were an urgent requirement. The corvettes, which were originally known as the frigates, but I'm not able to explain the difference between a corvette and a frigate, but we were now calling them corvettes. They were more than urgently required. They were already long overdue. And the maritime helicopters are helicopters that are to be located on the corvettes, so they were a secondary requirement to the requirement of the corvettes itself. So we put them as a secondary requirement. Going to the Alpha, we had a fleet of aircraft which are known as Cheetah fighter aircraft. We had 50, which included 12 dual-passenger Cheetah aircraft, and they had a upgrade during what they call a midlife upgrade. And so the Air Force were of the view that they could operate them until 2012. We were now in 1999. So given the time, primarily, we reached a conclusion that these aircraft were not immediately required. So I think let me stop there, and I can tell you the rest of the story of the Alpha as it unfolds.
You say you want to tell us the story as it unfolds at the appropriate time.
If you would like me to carry on with it now, I can, because it goes on to the whole option to cancel, which is in the later pages.
Maybe before you do that, I should ask a question. As to whether you say the Alpha would be required later. Now, this comment, is it a comment that is informed by the discussions that you had held with the relevant arm of service and other stakeholders in respect of the procurement of the equipment?
Yes, I think it's a purely factual observation based on the information that the existing fleet of Cheetah aircraft would be able to operate until 2012, and you would then need a new fleet to be in place by that time. So there was the idea that there would be, in the context of affordability, there was some time that gave a breathing space to the South African government to manage its need for the advanced fighter aircraft. Whereas the other categories were already due immediately, or in the case of the corvettes, overdue. The fighter aircraft were still to become due. So it was simply factual information that was presented back to the negotiating team, and which we were then to take into account in the discussion about what was affordable and what were the risks of the package and how to manage those risks.
Right, thank you. Will you then take us through that issues around the Alpha and what was actually presented at this meeting of the 26th day of May 1999 to the Ministerial Committee?
The Alpha was also linked to a very substantial proposal for industrial participation with significant benefits for Denel and the defense industry through participation in sale of these aircraft, the Gripen aircraft, worldwide that would follow from the South African sale, and then also on the non-defense industrial participation. The proposal involved significant benefits to South Africa. So there was a industrial participation benefit to the inclusion of the Alpha. So on the 26th of May in the Ministers' Committee, we recommended, with a view of considering the parameters of affordability, that the Alpha package should be postponed, that the South African government should take an option to acquire the Alpha from the suppliers, and should in turn seek to offer the supplier the hand of collaboration for the industrial participation that they wanted to do. So kind of a difficult offer for them to still invest in the things that they wanted to invest in, but to have the option. With some discussion, this was supported, although most of the Ministers' Committee, I'd say unanimously, was skeptical about whether they would sign such an option. And
when you say such an option, are you talking about the option to cancel? No. Okay, the NIP, the one that addresses, okay.
The option to the South African government,
yes,
to acquire in its discretion at a future point.
Okay, right, thank you.
The discussions that followed the 26th of May meeting were with the British Aerospace and Saab, were along the lines that didn't present them with something that represented a favorable economic outcome, because the bulk of the industrial participation work that would come to Denel would not then arrive if the South African government had not made a landmark acquisition, because such an acquisition would have been the first sale of such equipment outside of Sweden, where it was the standard equipment used by the Swedish Air Force. So they wouldn't have that reference site outside of Sweden, which would be negative. And the investment required at risk for the industrial participation and non-defense industrial participation, and the costs associated with that, would not make sense in the context of an option where the South African government could decide just as easily to say no in the future. So they presented in return a different option, one which would manage the affordability concerns of the South African government as expressed through the negotiating team, but which would give them the benefit of a reference site and would give them the benefit of a transaction that was a real transaction. And so they came up with the option to cancel and to have 3 tranches, where there was a first tranche with the dual aircraft, 2-seater aircraft, and then a second tranche with the single-seater Hawk fighter trainers, and a third tranche with the Gripen advanced fighters. And that allowed for the risks in the event that there were certain pressures on the South African economy at the time that those options, those purchases became due. It allowed the South African government the opportunity to cancel and minimize any exposure to financial crisis if that risk came about. So that was their counter, and that was the report that we eventually had to take forward to the affordability to the 31st of August meeting for discussion at the Ministers' Committee there.
Now, paragraph 7 of this document. Paragraph 7 at page 22.
Yes.
That is where you are dealing with an alternative that was proposed by the for a full transaction to supply 24 Hawk and 28 Gripen with the first delivery at a certain period. And then on paragraph 8, you actually elaborate about the tranches that were proposed. Now, do the two paragraphs fall within the terrain of the meeting of the 26th day of May 1999, or is it something that was addressed at the meeting of the 31st day of August 1999?
On the 26th May, we had our first discussion at the Ministers' Committee meeting, which dealt with the possibility of deferring the what is called the Alpha package. So no discussion had taken place with the suppliers prior to that. After the 26th of May meeting, we then proceeded to have these discussions with the supplier, as a result of which they came back to us with the proposal of an option to cancel. And the results of those discussions were then presented as an input to the Ministers' Committee meeting on the 31st of August, and then they had to decide about this proposal from British Aerospace.
Right. So you mentioned that at the meeting of the 26th day of May, you had not actually started the negotiations relating to cancellations and what have you. What I would like to get from you is whether the meeting of the 26th day of May 1999 gave you the mandate to go and negotiate with the identified suppliers, BAE in particular, the terms that you are now talking about, the terms that are based on the right to cancel in the event the government is not able to or is not interested in proceeding with acquisition of further equipment.
Thank you. Can I draw your attention to Annexure JN 4, which is on page 45 of the file. And if you would turn to the next page, page 46. And if you take note at the bottom of that page, which is the minutes, this is the minutes of the Subcommittee of Cabinet Ministers on the Strategic Defense Package meeting 26 May 1999, held at the Tambo House, Church Street, Pretoria. So item number 4 at the bottom of page 46 says Gripen recommendation, and then it says the chief negotiator recommended to the ministers that the decision to defer the requirement for a Alpha advanced light fighter aircraft should be considered. This recommendation was based on the fact that the alpha requirement is for 2005 to 2010. However, the military's, and then on the next page it continues, requirement for a fighter aircraft program is still valid. Hence, a combined Hawk and Gripen requirement could be considered as an addendum contract to a Hawk contract. The letter submitted by Department of Finance to the chief negotiator was tabled and discussed by the ministers. After a brief discussion, the minister decided to defer the Gripen decision and to mandate the negotiating team to explore the option of accommodating the SANDF long-term requirement of 28 Gripens into a consolidated BAE contract. After this discussion of the 26th of May, we then engaged with British Aerospace.
Right, thank you. Will you then proceed to paragraph 8 of your statement in page 22 of the bundle? Maybe then, just for smoother reading and following of your evidence, I should invite you then to commence with paragraph 7, because that is where now you introduce this issue of the option to cancel agreement.
I'm reading now from page 22, paragraph 7, which starts, as an alternative, with a first delivery of 12 Hawk aircraft and the dual-seater Gripen aircraft, and an option to the South African government to cancel on the supply of the remaining Hawk aircraft, followed by another option to cancel on the single-seater Gripen aircraft. The option involved a purchase contract for the full amount, with the aircraft to be constructed and delivered in 3 batches. The South African government, however, had the right to cancel tranches 2 and 3 without paying any cash breakage costs. This offer was different from a contract to procure, say, 12 Hawk and 9 Gripen, with a cost-free option to order another 12 or 19 Gripen at a later date. In the latter case, the government would sign a contract for expenditures for tranche 1 only. In the former, the government would need to secure finance for all 3 tranches at the outset, albeit with an escape clause covering the latter 2 tranches. The concept of an option to cancel was motivated by BAE SAB on the ground that it would allow the financing terms to be contractually locked in without prejudice to the South African government's right to decide not to go ahead with the rest of the procurement. Either option could be structured without restricting government's capacity to decide whether or not to acquire the additional equipment, and no cost would be payable should the South African government elect to exercise its option to cancel. On the other hand, the structure of an option to cancel could achieve the purpose of contractually locking in price and loan terms. The choice posed to the Ministers' Committee on 31st August 1999 then, in the light of its previous decision, was either to fully defer the Alpha package without taking any options, or to accept the proposed combination package. The latter option was recommended by the Ministers' Committee and accepted by the Cabinet.
Right.